Hello, and welcome to Grey.com Talks List. Today, we're talking with Sarah Fitzsimmons, Director of Restoration at the American Chestnut Foundation, a nonprofit conservation and research organization dedicated to return the iconic American chestnut tree to its native range. And if you're new to our podcast, please press subscribe button either on YouTube or your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about what is an American chestnut tree, its uniqueness, and why is it important to restore it. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to Grey.com Talks List. We're excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to talk with you.
Wonderful. Could you please describe American Chestnut Foundation for someone who is not familiar with your work?
Sure. The American Chestnut Foundation was founded in 1983 to build off of work that was started in the early 1900s, geared toward rescuing and restoring native tree species called the American chestnut, whose range is primarily in the eastern United States.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. So you guys have been you're not a new organization. You have a distinct history, and you said the work on restoring American chestnut tree has started in the early 1900s. So that's quite an unique path, quite a long path of a journey of saving this species. Could you please describe the history behind American chestnut tree?
Sure. So the American chestnut was a very densely populated species in the eastern U.S. Throughout the 1800s. It came into prominence primarily due to European settlement in the eastern United States. And it was called a cradle-to-grave species because it had so many uses. It could be used for cribs, it could be used for coffins, and everything in between. And so that was its economic benefits. Then it has many ecological benefits. It's an amazing hard mast producer. It produces chestnuts that lots of different types of wildlife eat. The leaves are highly nutritious and great for insect species, which then feed birds and other wildlife. So it's what we call in the U.S. a jack of all trades species. It does a lot of really great things. It's not the best at anything. It doesn't grow the fastest or the biggest. It doesn't produce the most seeds, but it does all of those things really well. But then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a fungal disease was imported from Asia, and people started noticing the American chestnut trees dying in various locations. And in the early 1900s, 1904, there was a zoologist in New York City at the Bronx Zoo who finally isolated an organism from dying chestnut trees at the zoo, named it the chestnut bark disease, and realized that it was a fungal pathogen. And from there, so even though the pathogen had already been in the U.S. for a few decades, we really call 1904 kind of when the disease first started in New York City, and you could see that the disease killed virtually all of the entire population by 1950. It had gone through the entire range, all the way through the eastern U.S. And like I said, we're working on work that was started when those trees first started dying. In response to the trees dying, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, started sending plant explorers to China to try and find replacements for the American chestnut. And that's what brought over the Chinese chestnut. And that didn't work. And then over the years, people tried various different methods of breeding and fungicides, and people even tried throwing chestnuts into nuclear reactors for mutational breeding as a way to try and restore the species. Obviously, none of that worked, or we wouldn't be here today. But that was the origin of people trying to find ways to stop the spread of this disease, to restore the species. And here we are today, still continuing to fight the fight.
It's quite an interesting history that you mentioned about the American chestnut. It had many purposes that it could be used for, both for in terms of building a log, as well as for wildlife. It provided a source of nutrition, a source of food for wildlife. So it's interesting that although it wasn't something super unique, but it was quite in a large extent available for both for people and animals. Yet because of the disease, it came to a situation where it almost became an extinct. Could you please explain to us? Does this disease is still does it still exist, and is it spreading? And what kind of research is being done if it is spreading to stop it?
Yeah, good question. So the disease is still present. It will never go away. It's what you call a facultative saprophyte, which
Mhm.
all that means is that it's really it does a great job as a pathogen, as a parasite, but it can also just live in the soil. It can live in the duff layer, just kind of hanging out, waiting for a host to feed on as well. So the disease is never going to go away. Another reason that it's never going to go away is there are still an estimated 435 million American chestnut trees on the landscape. The kicker is that most of those trees are very small. They're about 15 feet in height. Most of them do not produce chestnuts. What happens is they resprout from the roots. They get the disease, they die back, and then they resprout from the roots, and they get the disease, and they die back, and they're kind of caught in this endless vegetative resprouting cycle. And over time, these sprouts do eventually die. They eventually exhaust for any number of reasons. So there's still a lot of trees on the landscape. Technically the species is not threatened or endangered or extinct because there are so many trees, individuals out there. We call it functionally extinct because it's not serving the function of the species, and it's not reproducing, it's not producing mast, it's not, giving any sort of ecological benefit to its niche. What we're trying to do is basically throwing whatever we can at this disease. So things that we're trying to do to stop the disease is some biocontrol methods, one of which is trying to make the fungus sick with a virus, and that's called hypovirulence. And so there's research being done on that. There's research being done with breeding, traditional breeding. So, like the corn that we eat today, or apples, or any kind of produce that you can think of, all of that, the amazing things that we get to eat are made possible because of centuries of breeding, right? Making big kernels on corn, making, rice really big and easy to grow in lots of different kinds of situations. All of that's due to traditional breeding. And so we're trying to do that, bringing disease resistance from the Asiatic species, Japanese chestnut, Chinese chestnut, into the American chestnut. And so that's ongoing. And then the final way that we're trying to do this is through biotechnology. And there are lots of different things you can do with biotech. I think the first thing that comes to people's mind is genetic engineering, and transgenics, and that's one direction. Kind of looking into the future, gene editing, so we're trying to figure out ways that we can edit the genome and give the tree resistance. So those are the three primary methods. It's what we call 3-BUR. You've got 3 Bs, biocontrol, breeding, and biotechnology. And then you are united for restoration. So 3-BUR, and we like that term because there are 3 chestnuts in a chestnut burr. And then that's a really easy way to remember, that it's not going to be any single technique that's going to restore the species. We're really going to have to rely on, because it's such a complicated problem. It's huge in temporal and geographical scale. This project is going to take so much time and across multiple generations, that we need to make sure that we have an eye on any technique that we can use, and also an eye on the future, what future techniques are going to be available, and make sure that we are set up to take advantage of those in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for clarifying that they are not extinct in terms of the numbers, but they are extinct they're functionally extinct. So they grow to a certain size. You mentioned 15 feet, and then they stop. So their functionality of them, that is supposed to be, they're supposed to grow larger, and they're supposed to provide chestnuts. It's not being done. So that's a great clarification that you mentioned. So thank you for that. And the fact that you mentioned there's not one solution that can be implemented. There needs to be multiple solutions. So you mentioned you guys use 3 Bs, and the combination of all of them is bringing science and bringing your foundation one step closer to restoring the American chestnut tree. Could you please describe to us how do American chestnut trees grow in special forests, or can people grow it in their backyards? What's the soil needs to be for them to grow? So we can have understanding on more detailed understanding on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the American chestnut, most chestnuts, so there, I'm going to back up a little bit if you don't mind. There are, depending on who you talk to, what taxonomist you follow, there are between 7 and 10 or 12 different species of chestnut, and all of them exist across the temperate world. So you've got the European chestnut in Europe, the Castanea sativa, you've got 5 or 6 species in Asia, you've got 3 in China, 1 in Japan. People argue about whether or not there's a Korean chestnut. And then you've got 3 species in America. You've got Castanea dentata, which is what we're talking about, the American chestnut, and then 2 chinquapin species, which have a much smaller range and are a little bit, they're different, but they're distinct species. And so largely the cultural requirements, the site requirements for all those species are largely similar. There's some wiggle room amongst all of them. They all tend to prefer well-drained soils. They like, sandy soils, rocky soils. They tend to, or maybe mesic, but they don't like wet soils. So you're not going to be growing them in wetlands or bottomlands or swamps, things like that. That these species don't grow there. You often make chestnuts are equivalent with mountainous regions. And so, I've had the pleasure of traveling in many locations in China, looking at Castanea mollissima and the other species there in China. And usually if you're in the mountains, you're seeing all 3 of those species or a couple of them. Obviously, they're cultivated to a great degree because people really love eating chestnuts. And so in Europe, you're going to find the European chestnut cultivated widely, particularly in the mountainous regions, because they grow really well in the mountains. And that's another benefit because in these mountainous regions that are too difficult to cultivate for other crops, you can grow a tree species and use lands that are relatively marginal for other crop species. And so that's a really great benefit for chestnut. You can also, like a lot of nuts, you can grind chestnut meal into a flour. And so a lot of cultures, especially in I guess wherever chestnut existed, but in the U.S., the indigenous peoples, the Cherokee Indians in the United States were well known for producing chestnut flour and making a chestnut bread out of that native species. And you can see these really neat cross-cultural ties across all these different species across the temperate world. So largely you're going to find chestnuts, the American chestnut included, in the mountains. You're going to find them on mountainsides. When people are hiking, a really famous trail in the U.S. is called the Appalachian Trail, and it's a 2,000-mile long trail that traverses the Appalachian Mountains longitudinally, south and north along the eastern U.S. And you can count chestnuts, the sprouts, the little 15-footers. You can count thousands of them because that really transects the native range of the chestnut. People do keep them in their yards. For those of you not familiar with chestnut, the burrs, what the fruit comes in, look like little urchins, like sea urchins. They have really spiny husks. And so you can imagine what that's like in your yard. If you have this tree in your yard, it's great for nut production. People love to eat them, but you're not going to go barefoot running in your lawn if you have a chestnut tree. They last a really long time. And so, do people have them in their yards? Sure. But typically people like to keep them in their back 40 or up in the mountains because they're not particularly compatible with yard type activities.
Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting that there is so much intersection of cultures when it comes to chestnuts. You mentioned European chestnuts. You mentioned that American chestnut was very specific for indigenous Indian Americans because they grew flowers of it. They made it to the bread. So there was more unique implementation of the chestnut that could be used. So we can see the history behind the functionality of the chestnut chestnuts. But looking at today, for instance, we mentioned that the chestnuts used to they are used for logs and for food as for wildlife. But as in today's century, in 21st century, in today's age, what are the functionalities of chestnuts besides people consuming chestnuts? It's a nut. It's a tasty nut. Could you please describe on that?
Yeah, well, today unfortunately you can't get chestnut. Well, at least not American chestnut lumber. Pretty much all the wood of American chestnut that's available in the market is recycled from mainly barns that are being torn down. So there's a really big market for what they call antique lumber stuff. Big boards and big logs that people tear down out of barns that are being recycled for whatever reason, and people are fetching $15 to $20 a board foot, which is just a tremendous amount of money for these kinds of products. In the U.S., most of the lumber that's used is southern yellow pine. This wood is grown. You can grow it really fast. You can turn over rotations really, really quickly. The land that they're using, it's real sandy lands, particularly in the southeastern United States, and you can get timber type trees in 20 to 30 years, if that. So it really fast growing timber that you can grow really fast. I think the American chestnut, it could be similar to that. In the eastern United States, you can grow saw logs, you can grow timber logs in probably 30 to 50 years, which is not quite as fast as southern yellow pine, but it can grow very quickly. And what I hope we can do with chestnut is have a more durable wood product than pine. Pine you need to treat with chemicals to make it more rot resistant. The thing with chestnut is that you can get a fast growing tree with rot resistance that's inherent in the species. I think that's relatively true to the other chestnut species as well in Europe and China and Japan. But in my experience, these species tend to not be used as much for timber as the American chestnut was in the U.S. They are, but not as much. They tend to be used primarily for nut production. That seems to be their primary goal with those species. And I think a big difference too is the American chestnut is the smallest of the true chestnuts of all the species. The American chestnut nut is about the size of a dime, maybe a quarter. And I don't know if that's equivalent to all of your listeners. I don't know what the size is otherwise. Maybe a small marble. But then the Chinese chestnut is, maybe twice the size of that. And then the Japanese and European chestnuts are much, much larger. There's a cultivar in the US called Colossal, which is a European-Japanese hybrid. And that's about as big as your fist. I mean, you can imagine a chestnut that large and how much more useful that is from a cultivation purpose than a much smaller nut, which is more geared toward, wildlife or maybe a niche market. So that's why I think the American chestnut's use, while it produces an edible product for wildlife and humans, its primary purpose is wood. So I think we will see an eventual return to the lumber market of American chestnut, but we're a couple hundred years from that. If the work that we're doing right now, pans out, then we're a couple hundred years away from that.
You mentioned that the uniqueness of American chestnuts used for the wood compared to others, it's a long lasting. So instead of cutting trees every year or every 2 year or every 5 year, you can use American chestnut and cut them less, and it will lead to less deforestation, which will eventually lead to combating climate change. So it's important for restoring and growing American chestnuts is important for our climates. It's important to preserving our environment. So it's important for our viewers and listeners to understand that American chestnuts, especially in the United States, they can take a huge role in combating a fight against climate change. If someone would...
I was going to say that's a really great point. And so I mentioned southern yellow pine, which is not quite as rot resistant and which requires chemical treatment in order to be used for the various uses that it has. I I had the great joy of visiting Cape Cod, which is in Massachusetts. It's on the coast, the eastern coast of the U.S., and there's a chestnut telephone pole that's been standing since 1928. So this pole has been in use for almost 100 years. It's never been treated with creosote, which is another chemical to try and make these things rot resistant. So you have a species that can be used for fences, for poles. Obviously, the carbon sequestration is going to be better when the tree's living, but even in use, you can see, a tree which can withstand 100+ years of weathering on its own without chemical treatment, how much carbon storage capacity a species like that can have. So on the stump, it's even better, but in use, you can see the tremendous advantage over species, other fast-growing species that require constant turnover, that require chemical treatment. There's a great advantage to these more rot-resistant species.
Absolutely, their advantage, based on what you have described, their advantage is obvious and very unique and long-lasting. If someone would like to support the research that your organization is doing, how can they do that?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So the American Chestnut Foundation, we have a website, TACF, the American Chestnut Foundation.org. Or basically, if you look up American Chestnut, we'll probably pop up at the top. So if you want to go to our website, we have a couple different ways to support our organization. You can make a one-time donation. You can join as a sponsor member. And start to grow chestnuts with us just as a research purposes, or you can just decide to give to various types of our research, be it either scientific or applied on the ground, and sponsor some of our plantings that are going in on things like reclaimed mine lands and other projects that we're doing to try and not only restore the species, but also restore lands that need recovered as well.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. The link to American Chestnut Foundation will be provided in the description. So for you listening, and if you would like to learn more about the great work that Sarah and her team are doing, you can learn about it. And if you'd like to support them, you can do that by visiting their website and clicking the donate page. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was wonderful to get to know you and the great work your organization is doing in restoring American chestnut tree.
Thanks so much. It was really a pleasure.
For you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, please press like and share button, because this will show that this conversation is important, that restoring American chestnut tree can help us in the fight against climate change. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.